Start recording. Okay, so everybody probably has a version of a bottle in some varying degree. Again, you are welcome to follow along, or you are welcome to just tinker or just watch. However you learn best, that's cool. Like you're the learner, I'm the teacher. Um,
What if our form of learning involves out-of-the-body experiences?
Got to find that somewhere else. Uh, so the couple of things that I want to cover, I'm going to go somewhat fast, just because I'm recording this and because you can kind of go over it a little bit. But still, if you have any issues, slow me down. So first thing, let's cover some lighting stuff. So this is a pretty nice feature in Maya, and I know it. Yes.
These two computers don't have the sticker on the front that says DMC 920 or 290.
Oh, goodness.
And they're both have 2017 symbol.
Really?
Yes.
So there may be another number on the very top up here. It's like 90 something. Do you see a little sticker on the very top of the computer? Right there. If you can see one there, just write that number down, and then also write down that it doesn't have the.
There's one on the side that has the ATSU.
Oh, is it?
That has the number.
Okay, yeah. As long as it should be like BMC 290 something. If you can find that number, it doesn't have that one, but it has one that's 90 something.
No, the one on.
Let me just.
There's a barcode.
The barcode.
It does. There's a barcode.
Yeah, write that number down and also notate that there's no sticker on it, because that means we need to sticker those. This is quite the eventful semester. Is it? So there's no number on it anywhere on that one? Really? Can you just write down like roughly where it is, like second row back on the instructor side of the room, corner to computers have no number. I don't know what happened to this one, but hopefully, thank you, I appreciate it. Okay, so how many of you like lighting? So, so what we're going to talk about today is how to correctly use that skylight, yeah, the skydome light, right? So if we go to Arnold lights, there's this skydome light, right? And how most of you have probably been using it is if you create that, it puts this giant orb around your entire scene, right? And this orb is a light, right? So if I go into Arnold, hit Arnold render view, we're going to get white light coming from all directions. It's like that, it blows everything out, right? This is not, you can see it a little bit better on my monitor, but like it really tones everything down. Of course, we can change this color a little bit. We could knock this down to a gray, and you can start to see that a little bit. But this is really kind of not a very useful way of lighting stuff. If you have a ground plane in here, like if we were to go ahead and put a floor here, let me stop this. So I'm going to put just a plane in here, scale that up really big, right? It helps a little bit because we start to get a little bit more of that environment in there, right? But what's happening is this entire orb is casting light inward, right? And that light is bouncing around the scene. And so we're getting some pretty interesting and somewhat realistic lighting if that were a real place in the world. If there was a real giant empty white room that you could stand in, this is what the lighting would look like, especially if the walls glowed, right? That's usually not the situation our scenes are in, right? So I'm going to show you how to make an environment for this that kind of gives us some real world lighting in just a few clicks, and I'm going to show you kind of quickly how to make this thing like look more like a studio setting. Like this was photographed in like a studio that gives you sort of a nice environment, right? So first, just so we can see this a little bit better, I'm going to change my render size. I go in here, and I'm going to go ahead and make this HD 1080. It'll go a little slower, right? But you'll be able to see them a little bit better now. Maybe HD 780 will be good, or 720. There we go. That's good. Right. So again, all this is this casting white light inwardly. And really, what this means is that we can have our lights be a color, right? So in the real world, if you were doing an effect shot where you need the Hulk like bashing up like Central Park or wherever he's bashing, what you could do is you can incorporate him into that scene by getting real lighting from that actual location. And the way we do that is we would take, it's kind of hard to explain how this physically happens, but you take a full 360-degree view image of the environment, right? Usually this is done by you setting like a chrome orb or something in the room and taking a lot of pictures of that, because then we can unwrap that. But cameras have settings too, right, that allow us to adjust our lighting. So we could change our camera settings to where if I took a picture in this room, it's really dark, or if I changed it, I could take a picture in this room and make it brighter just by changing my shutter speed and all of that stuff, right? So what we're going to do is we're going to use a special type of image, and we're going to wrap that image around that sky dome, and that image is not only going to have photographic information, it's going to have lighting information in it as well. So instead of it being one image, it's actually multiple images layered together with various different intensities of that lighting, okay? This type of image is called an HDR image. How many of you have heard of that before? So you probably see those numbers on your iPhone when you go to take a picture, or whatever phone you got. I'm sure they're all HDR images, right? You take a picture, it has like up here in the top corner, HDR, right? That stands for high dynamic range, okay? Think of it this way. When you take a picture just with a Polaroid or whatever, right? That pixel on your image is a solid color. It's white or it's black, it's green, it's red or whatever. And what this is allowing us to do is say each of those pixels can have a whole spectrum of brightnesses, right? So don't sweat the details about this too much. Just know that there's a lot of really, really benevolent people out there who are creating HDR images for us and giving them away for free. And so we can use those to light our scene. So I'm going to show you where a few of those are. One place you can find them is actually on the network. So the ETSU E3 server. Some of you have probably already noticed that there's this DIGM students folder here. And under here is usually where most people will store their files temporarily. There's a share folder in here where you can put some of your stuff, right? But instead, I'm going to go all the way up to the top in this student resources folder. So there's a couple of things in here I want to call your attention to. One of them is this HDR panoramas, and that's what we're going to be looking for. The other thing is if you've ever tried to use the render farm, this is where you find the tutorial on how to use the render farm as well. So it's right here, render farm instructions, okay? I would strongly recommend you play around with that, because the further we, or at least watch that video, because the further we get into this process, the more complicated your renders are going to become and the slower they're going to become. And the render farm, how many of you have used the render farm successfully? Okay, a couple people. It will significantly save you time. Like in that way, like if your render is going to take 10 hours on one computer, it will take 30 minutes on the render farm, right? It is crazy, helpful. So that's where you can find information about that, but it's a really long process, so I can sit down with you and help you as well, but if you want to watch that. What we're really looking for right now are these HDR panoramas, okay? And when you open this, you'll notice that most of these files are in a format that is not something you've probably heard of before, right? We have these .hdr images. We have a .exr. We've seen those. That's how we export out that's how we render out, right? None of these are JPEGs, right? Because a JPEG has a very limited color and brightness range. An HDR image has a much wider color and brightness range, and that means it's packing in more information. So I'm just going to grab a few of these just to try them out. Actually, let's just open this one up. I'm going to open up this bus garage in EXR so you can see what one of them looks like. And it's going to ask me about that. I'll say okay. And so this is what we're going to get. And it's very weird. It's very distorted. It kind of looks like a panorama, but it wraps all the way around. Like, the interesting thing about this is if you apply it to a sphere, it's going to wrap all the way around that sphere pretty perfectly. And that's what we want, right? We want it to wrap around that sphere that's going to be our environment. So the thing to recognize as well, though, is that this has brightness information, right? There's a light out here. It's kind of dark over here, right? And so that's what this is going to use to light our scene. So let's just grab a few of these. I'm just going to airport. Let's go down here and grab urban exploring interior, Mako structure. There we go. I'm just Control-C'ing to copy those. And then I'm going to put those in my source images folder of my project. And of course, you all remembered to set your project before you got started. So, okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab my HDRI, I'm sorry, my Sky Dome object, right? And in the color channel of this, I'm going to apply one of those images. All right, so if I go here, click on that little checkerboard box, click on File, it's going to say which file, and I'll go tell it any of these will work. And so if you see when I click on these, it will bring up examples of them. Here's that bus garage we were looking at earlier, right? Huh? Go with the beach? I didn't grab it, I don't think. That one? Cool.
I'm sorry, I got a little lost. Is it okay if you back up a little bit?
Yep. Which part?
Go to the student references. What folder do you click on to get the backgrounds?
It's HDR panoramas.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And it's just any of the ones with the...
Yeah, actually, in any of the files in there, probably not the TX files. That looks like where somebody just clicked on one of those and applied it. But yeah, let's go ahead and do the beach. All right. And I'm going to hit open. And you'll see what it did is it applied that to my environment, right?
Wait, what did you click on?
So let me go back and do that one more time. So I select my Sky Dome that I have, and I click on the little checkerboard out at the end of color, and then File, because I want it to use a file to do this. And then I click this little folder on File, and then do Corsica Beach.exr, open. And you'll see that that shows up in here. Now, what that means is that that previous render we had is very bland, right? There's like, if this thing is reflective, all it's reflecting is the white background. So like we can't really see any reflections in it. All of the light that's coming in is white. And that's actually not the real world, right? If you go outside and you walk around, you're getting some bounce light from the green grass. You're getting blue from the sky. You're getting red if you walk close to the building. There's colors everywhere, right? And that's one of the reasons that even though this looks good, it looks flavorless, right? Like this looks like a sterile hospital environment, right? It has no personality to it. Well, when I hit render with this new lighting, we're going to get a different result. So it's still bright, right? And these are still white objects, right? But you'll notice some stuff in here, like this ground now has a little bit of a tint of blue to it. You'll notice some stuff, like we're getting some color. Well, wait until this kind of clears up a little bit. You'll start to see a little bit of color in it. Now, if you did this with like an orange sunset and the sun was coming from one direction, but it was like blue in the other direction, we would be getting orange light coming from one direction and blue coming from the other. There are really subtle differences in here, though. Those subtle differences start to add up and make this render feel much closer to photorealistic. So if we had a completely white bottle setting on this beach, this is the light we would get. Okay. So a lot of things in here are very subtle, but this is going to be the difference in something seeming like, yeah, that looks nice, and something actually feeling real, right? And once this is done rendering, if this were the type of bottle we were going for, just this plain white bottle, we're going to be using the actual real lighting that was in that scene to get this, or to get this render. So you'll notice, you maybe not be able to see it as well, but I got a little bit of yellow lighting coming from this side, whereas the light coming from this side is brighter. And all of this is going to be dependent on that image. I can change that image to one of these other options. So this is urban exploring interior. And then we're going to get lighting that is completely different. Can I save this one as a temp? What does that do? Nah, don't worry about it right now. So if I hit render on this, so we're getting completely different lighting, okay? Now again, we can still crank up and down the brightness. If this is feeling a little too bright to you, we can still change that on our Sky Dome just by changing the intensity or by changing the exposure, right? So I can turn that intensity down a little bit and start getting a little bit more information here. Now, currently my bottle isn't super reflective, so I'm going to make something in here reflective. Let's go ahead and grab my taco sauce bottle here, right? And I'm going to go ahead and add a new material to it. Assign new material. I'm going to do the AI standard surface. And let's just try a preset of something like, let's do chrome. Chrome is super reflective. Okay. And so now we're going to see that it's also reflecting my environment around me. It's reflecting the floor. Let's try a different preset. Car paint, replace. There we go. So we're going to still see like some highlights in here where it's reflecting the background. Lots of different things in here that's allowing us to adjust this. So let's do replace this with gold, right? And so these are. So I wanted to show you this because we can use this to get a pretty nice, just like standard lighting in our room without having to spend forever working on lighting. Now, later in the lighting and rendering class, you're going to learn how to take this and build on it. Like, this isn't really finished. There's still things that, as an artist, we would want to control, because the lighting in the real world isn't always perfect either. If you go out and film footage for some class, for one of Livingston's classes, like, you're going to end up having to add additional lighting to get stuff looking perfect as well, right? And so there's still reasons to add that. Maybe you wanted a little bit extra lighting coming from one side. You may have to add an additional light. But this is a really good start, right? This will really get you a good start. So the last thing I wanted to show you was sort of a little trick on how to get our bottles in sort of this empty room environment, right? Something that looks nice but isn't distracting with a bunch of corners, right? This is a technique that's actually used in studio photography quite a bit, which is a wall and a floor that doesn't have a sharp corner, right? It has like sort of a rounded corner. And so that's actually really pretty easy to make inside of Maya. Let's go ahead and stop this rendering. And I'm going to go ahead and use this floor object that I have here. I'm going to make it much bigger. Right? And so there's a couple of different ways we could do this. One is I could just go grab all of these faces right here, right? And then rotate them. So I do something like this, move that up, move it forward, right? And then when I hit 3 on this object mode, we're going to get this rounded wall in the background, right? And when I go in here to render for this now, instead of getting like they're standing on some plane floating in space, I'm going to get something that feels a little bit more like a studio environment, right? We're still getting some interesting highlights on this from that reflection of the environment outside of it. And we're getting some of the bounce lighting from those colors. We're getting a lot of different things in here, right? So I just wanted to show you some of these things because I think they're really like a time saver to be able to turn something that looks meh into something that looks pretty good. Yes.
When Arnold is rendering this stuff, is it rendering everything that you have on Maya, or is it rendering everything in the shot that it has to work with?
A little of both. There are okay. So think of it this way. I cannot currently see that sky dome that is around me, right? But that sky dome is casting light, and light is bouncing off of that sky dome, and reflections are coming off of that sky dome. So it is taking it into consideration. Right. Right. So really what Arnold is doing is it's calculating how points are bouncing off of all these objects. So if your object is more complicated, it doesn't care really. Like that's not really going to slow it down significantly. If you have a whole bunch of objects and all of them have bounce light coming off of them, or if you have a whole bunch of lights, or if you have a whole bunch of things that are going to cause your lighting to change, dropping a lot of shadows, that sort of stuff, that's where it starts to add up, right? And so a lot of you probably, your bridge probably rendered pretty quickly because all you really had was some models and a couple of other objects sort of sliding back and forth across that model, right? If you had a lot of interesting like reflective stuff going on, you had a whole bunch of different lights, and a few people had like headlights on their cars and stuff like that, then it's going to start bogging it down a little bit, and the rendering is going to go slower. And you'll notice that my render is going pretty slow right now. A lot of that is coming from that sky dome light that is casting the EXR on it, right? That's why I would strongly suggest like learning the render farm as soon as you can. I've thought about making it an entire day of class where we just sit down and try to learn it all together. I have a feeling that would be a hard day because the whole point of the render farm is that one person can put a render on 30 machines, not that 30 people can put a render on 30 machines. So like if we all did that together, it would be kind of slow. So what I would say is as you're getting your project done, especially if you're around over spring break, come in here and just spend an hour one day trying to get the render farm to work. Come grab me. I can help you with some of the details to it. I guarantee you, the first time getting it to work will be a little bit slow and arduous. The third time will not be as hard. The fifth time, it's just this glorious thing that you're like, why didn't I learn this sooner? Right? I would strongly encourage that just because, like I said, this one's still rendering. I don't remember even when I hit render on this one anymore. But one of the benefits of this environment is I didn't have to model an entire world, but it still feels like it's in a place, right? And this is something that you will sometimes see people do for a setting that doesn't necessarily have to involve an environment, right? Like if it's really more about the subject. So this is actually how you would see product photography done a lot. Like if you ever, you're at the store and there's like a bottle of Pert Plus or whatever, like an advertisement for it, then they probably did studio photography in some form of similar situation. It was just a real physical situation, not digital, right? So this is completely acceptable for your environment for this project. If you decide you want to do this, if you decide you want to do more and make a whole world for your bottle, like if they're bouncing around on the kitchen table, that or on the kitchen countertop, that's fine too. I don't know why the shampoo's on the kitchen countertop, but all that's completely your call. But this is acceptable if the environment modeling is not something you're enjoying. So okay, I'm also going to go ahead and put something different on here because this gold thing is not cool. As standard, let's just do. Right now, I'm just going to do plastic. Is plastic an option? Replace. There we go. There we go. So I'm happy with that. Something I was thinking about doing today was talking about UVs so we could put images on this bottle. I'll be honest, like UVs are really complicated, and I think that I would rather spend a little bit of time talking about rigging this bottle. Having said that, there's sort of an order and a process in which you would usually go through this, and usually getting some version of your UVs unwrapped is something you would do before you get too far along in the rigging process. Today we're not going to worry about that too much. Even if it messes up some of our textures, we can always fix that later. What I'm going to do, though, before I do anything, is I'm going to set this up to where I can focus in on the objects I want to focus in on, right? One of the things that's very annoying is when you try to select something and you accidentally select something else instead, like you're trying to select your bottle and you accidentally select the floor. I'm only going to work on one of these bottles at a time. So I'm going to put this bottle, my Tabasco sauce bottle, I'm going to put it in a group, and I'm going to just turn off that group. And then I'm going to put my floor in a different group, and I'm going to freeze that group so I can't select it, right? So for those of you who don't remember how to do that, you can kind of follow along. Under this channel box layer editor, actually let me just delete all these, because apparently I've done that before in this file. Delete layers. Ugh. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to grab the floor, and then I'm going to click this button over here, the little plane with the sphere on it. That's going to create a new layer and assign the object I have selected to that layer. So when I do that, now my floor is in that layer. I can turn it on and off. I don't want to turn it off. I just want to freeze it. So I'm going to click this button here twice until it has an R in it. And so now, even though it's in the scene, I can see it. I can't select it. Right? The hot sauce bottle, though, I just want to hide it because right now I'm going to rig the shampoo bottle. So I'm going to click this button here. My hot sauce is in a bottle or in a layer, and I can just turn the visibility off for that. I can double click on the name and label these. So I'll call this hot sauce layer, which I think is actually a pretty good band name. There we go. And ground. Save. There we go. Okay, so that means the only things that are really selectable in our scene right now, is actually our sky dome and our floor. I'm actually going to go ahead and add my sky dome to my background just so I don't accidentally select it. Because now I can just drag select, and the only thing I'm going to end up selecting is my bottle, right? Okay. Now, before I go much further, I want to talk about history, right? Some of you, if you select your bottle right now, actually maybe, yeah, we talked about this a little bit. Both of these apparently I've already deleted history on, so it's not the best example. But if you select one of these bottles, you're going to see a giant list of input nodes down here at the bottom, right? And that's because everything that we do to these models adds a new input to it. It's a new command that we took on that model, right? And Maya remembers all of those, and slowly it starts to bog stuff down. So before we rig, before we texture, usually after I'm done modeling, I want to delete the history on that. Okay. So again, I'm going to select the object. I'm actually going to select both of my objects, and I'm going to do edit, delete by type, history. Okay. And like we saw earlier, that's going to delete all of that information about how I constructed it. Now Maya thinks of it as a new model. Right? It's like it's just brand new, came out of the factory like that, right, or whatever. The other thing you're going to want to watch out for is like when we move objects around, right, we get all these values over here on our translates, our rotates, and our scales. Right now mine are clean. I should have found one that was a little messier so you could see it as an example. But I want those to be back to their default, back to 0 and 1, right? And so the way we can do that is to go to Modify and Freeze Transformations. So before we rig, you always delete history and freeze your transformations. Okay, those are big issues because rigging gets very taxing on the model. Right. What we're going to do is we're going to create some nodes that deform this thing on a pixel level. I'm sorry, on a vertex level every frame of the animation. So that's a lot of things to calculate. And if there's all these other things adding to that calculation, it just slows it down. So deleting history will really make the difference on whether you can actually play back the animation in Maya or not. So this is something we have to do before we rig it, because if we delete history after we rig it, the rig will not work anymore. And so we do this beforehand. I know I'm harping on it, but I know it's something people forget to do. So,
Where's history at?
So it's edit, delete by type, and then history. You sometimes have to be careful and not do delete all by type. That will delete history on everything in your scene. And I've seen people do that before. If you know that's what you want to do, that's cool. But if you don't, you have to kind of be careful there. Okay.
What was the command to freeze transformation?
And freeze transformations is under modify.
There's also an icon right there on top.
Modify freeze transformations, and where is it?
You just messed it.
Oh, right there? Yeah. So that's under the polygon modeling. So these are really, really handy. You'll start to see reasons we do this later, especially once you get into the technical direction class. So, all right. So here's where we're going to start making a rig for this, right? We already recognize that this is 2 models, and I still want this to stay 2 models. I modeled it this way just for that reason, right? But to make this animate together, that means we're going to have to do some form of grouping, right? Like with our car, I think what we did is we took the wheels and parented them underneath the car model, or maybe we parented them underneath a group node like a control. Both of those work, right? But the reason we do that is because, if I grab both of these now and move them, that works great. But if I rotate them, it doesn't, right? So I want these all to move together, right? Which means I'm not going to actually animate the mesh. I'm going to animate a control for our object, right? So just like we did with the car, I'm going to create a ring that I'm going to use as my control, or a curve, like a circle. And to do that, I can go to Create, NURBS Primitives Circle, or under the Curves and Surfaces tab here, I can just click the circle. And you'll see that what it's going to do is put a circle right there on the ground, right? It's tiny. I can barely see it underneath the model. So I'm going to scale this up, make it much bigger. And again, just so you can see this, all of these values in here, when I get ready to start animating, I want all of those to be back to the default. The reason for that is because it's called zeroing out your animation. So let's say you animate for a while and you're like, oh, you know what? I want to start this over. I want to just go back to how it was when I first rigged this character like it was a new scene. The easiest way to do that is if you've frozen your transformations, you can just set all of your translations and your rotations to 0, and your model will go back to its original position. Or all of the values that are in your channel box that need to be set to 0. So for this to work, I need to freeze my transformations again. So you'll see that this has that 5805 or 5802 value on there. If I just go to modify, freeze transformations, it's like that's a new object, right? And then I usually just delete my history again, right? So I'm going to name this. This is something that not a lot of people, like they kind of think of this as an afterthought, but while you're making these things, you should name them because eventually the objects in your scene are going to start to add up, right? You're going to have hundreds of objects in your scene, and you're going to be like, I wonder what polymesh 75 is. Like, just name it kind of quickly here. We'll call this bottle, and then I usually do CTRL for control, and so I know that when I'm just looking at my viewport here, that is an animation control. Right? This is something that I can grab that from my outliner and be able to animate or control the character, right? So if I want this control, I'm gonna quiz you all a little bit here. If I want this control to be what drives the motion of the bottle and the lid, how would you go about doing that?
You middle click the bottle and lid into the bottle control.
So I drag them into it.
Yeah, you
right?
drag it into it, make it a group basically.
So that's called parenting, right? Basically, what you're saying is you want me to make this bottle control a parent for those two objects, right? And so that means when I move the bottle control, those objects will go with it. So silk lid, silk bottle, holding control to get them both. And then I middle click, dragging that on top of bottle control. And what you'll see now is that those are underneath bottle control. And if I just click bottle control, now I can animate it around, and it's going to animate all of those objects underneath it. Now, I need you to recognize that even though it looks like I have the ring, the bottle, and the cap selected, I don't. The only object I currently have selected is the control. It highlights everything underneath there as if I also selected those meshes. I didn't. If I set a keyframe on what I have selected right now, I'm just setting it on that bottle control, not on those two meshes, right? Which means we can animate all of those things as well if we wanted to, but that sometimes is confusing to people because it looks like I have the whole thing selected. It's selecting the entire hierarchy is what it is. It's showing me everything that is a child of the object I have selected right now. So this is pretty much ready now. If I wanted to animate this sort of bouncing around, the only problem is there is no combination of rotating or moving or even scaling that I can do to get this object to bend in the middle, right? I also, although I could do some squash and stretch looking things, I can't really get this to deform its volume either. Like I can make it shorter and wider, right? And that's kind of squashing it, but at the same time, it's still the same volume, right? If I wanted it to look like it bulged out in the middle, I can't do that just by scaling it. And so a lot of rigging is going to be about deforming the shape of this model. And we actually haven't looked at deformers yet. We've looked at a lot of other things, but today we're going to talk about how a deformer works. And I'm going to sort of go off to the side and show, actually I'm going to open a whole new version of Maya separately to show you in there, just so you'll see how a deformer works. And then we're going to come back and we're going to add those things to this model. So let me just open up a new version of Maya on top of this. Okay. Why does it always put that there? Over here, please. There we go. So deformers are going to be in our animation menu or our rigging menu. You can also sometimes find, they're in the modeling menu as well. So the thing I want you to recognize is that a deformer is just a word that means we're going to manipulate the vertices of this object in a group fashion, right? It's not just moving one vertex at a time. It's a way that we can deform all of those on the entire object, right? So let's look at a few of these, and you can. I'm just going to show them kind of quickly. So I'm going to go ahead and create a cylinder here. Give it some height. Yeah, just go ahead and make this rounded cap. Give it some caps as well, just so you can kind of see this. All right. Oh, no, let's do height this way. All right. So now we got kind of this like elongated pill shape, right? And I want to give this thing some form of deformation, right? So all of these different deformers in here will allow me to deform those vertices that make up this pill shape in different ways. Blend shapes are really neat. That means I could basically re-sculpt the way this model looks into something specific, and I could blend into that new object. Clusters are interesting. Like there's a lot of different ones in here. Let me show you a lattice really quickly. So a lattice just puts a volume around the object. It's these boxes. And then I can grab these lattice points and sort of adjust the entire shape of the mesh with these. And then when I'm done, I can hit edit, delete by type, history. And that's now the new shape of my model, right? So it's a quick way that I can reposition all of those vertices without having to one at a time grab them or grab all the edges, right? So we can also do, there's a type of deformer called a joint or a skeleton, a bone. Different programs call them different things. Maya calls it the joint tool. And those will allow you to literally put a framework, like a skeleton, underneath your model and drive it in that way. So that's how we will actually end up rigging a character later. What I'm going to use for this, though, is something a little less complicated and a little more, it's a little more procedural. We're going to look at these nonlinear deformers right here, okay? Nonlinear really just means it's using some variation of math or an algorithm to generate this deformation, right? It's not always a one-to-one deformation. So let's try, as an example, let's try the, I'm going to try the wave option, right? Or no, actually I'm going to do sine. Sine makes more sense in this one. So if I choose sine, it doesn't look like anything happened. If I hit 4, you'll see now down the center of my object, there's a line. You see that line that goes down the center of it? And you'll see that over here in the inputs of that is this sine 1 input, right? And you'll notice that if I change my amplitude, I'm able to deform this object to that sine wave. I can also animate this offset, and I can animate that entire process, right? So if I wanted to make this look like a worm, or a snake swimming across the top of some water or whatever, we can do this. You can actually use this on a fish model, right, to get like a fish animation. There's a lot of different things we could use all of these deformers for. Now we can use it to actually change our model. We could use this to, if you were modeling something that you needed curved, you could run a sine wave on it or a bend or something like that to just curve your model, right? And then we just delete our history and it'll say like this. But we can also animate this, right? I can right-click on offset and say right-click key selected. And then I could go out here to the end, change my offset way up here, key selected, and now you'll see that when I play back this animation, that's my animation on this object now. So this is how deformers work. They're animatable. Actually, something we haven't expressly said, anything that has a number associated with it in Maya, you can animate. Like every value that you come across, you can animate the intensity of your lights, you can animate the color of your lights, you can animate the drop off, the high bound and low bound. Anything in the entire program that has a value, you can animate that value. Okay, and so all I'm doing right now is just animating the offset of a sine wave, right? Um, so I just wanted to show you that as like one of the deformers. I'm going to go ahead and delete that deformer. Now it's no longer affecting the object because it doesn't exist. Let's go back to these nonlinear deformers again. I'm going to go ahead and try a squash. This is one of the ones we're going to use on our bottle here in a minute, right? So with the squash, you'll see that it creates this object. If you look at it, it's really kind of one of the more complicated looking ones. There's a circle in the middle. There's two little tick marks at the top and bottom, and there's a line all the way through it, right? And under the squash input on that object, what we're looking for is factor. I'm sorry, no. Factor. So currently factor is set to 0. And if I turn that up, you'll see that my object stretches out. So that means it's going to get thinner in the middle, right? And try to preserve that volume. And if I push it inward, it's going to get fatter, right? So I can get this like squash and stretch on this object, okay? Unfortunately, it's a little like, it seems a little useless if it's squashing and stretching toward the middle, right? Because like our ball, the reason our ball squashes at all is because it's impacting the ground on the bottom, right? So we can make some changes to this, and really that circle in the middle is showing us sort of the central point of where our object is squashing and stretching. And you'll see that that's what this tick mark is here. So if I move this all the way to the ground, right, move this all the way to 0, right, and change that factor, you'll see now the bottom half of that is squashing and stretching. Also, a bunch of stuff underneath here that doesn't even exist is also trying to squash and stretch. And so that's why we have to sort of change some of these values. I can change my low bound to 0, and then my high bound up to the top of this. I usually just extend it until it goes at the top. For me, that's looking like around 2, right? And what that means now is that when I animate that factor, it's going to squash and stretch toward the ground. Okay. So a lot of this sometimes takes some experimenting to figure out how to get the object to deform, right? I'm going to go ahead and delete that squash and stretch and show you the bend option. So I can do the same thing with that. If we go to deform, nonlinear bend, right? It doesn't look like anything happened, but it's just that line that goes through the center of it. So I can check select my bend 1 handle, and under the bend 1 input, I can adjust curvature, right? Now we have a kielbasa or something. So my low bound, I can take that down to 0, and I could just have the top of it, or I can move this all the way down to the ground and extend this up through the top with the high bound higher. Right? And now I have this curvature, this, right? Now, the other thing I want you to recognize is that this is dependent. I really wish I'd have chosen a different shape now. That's why we maintain our history, is because I can go turn that off. Turn off my cap. There we go. So that's how history works too, is I can go back and make changes to this. So one of the things I want to point out is that this bend is happening based off of the location of this bend modifier, right? So if I put a lot of curve in here, right, it's curving from the ground. But if I move this bend modifier up, it changes where that bend is happening, right? And so I can change my curvature to be closer to the top. And so that's a value I can animate just by animating my translate Y. The other thing you need to notice is that if I move this away from my object, things start getting weird, right? Like this can mess up very easily, right? Or if I move my object away from the deformer, it messes up, right? So these two things need to stay together, right? And we've kind of learned how we can do that already. So let's go ahead and go back to our bottle, right? So in this scene, I'm going to do both of those two deformers, right? Because as we saw, we can do a squash and stretch. We saw that we can do a bend, right? We can actually do both of those at the same time, right? But the way they deform will sort of change depending on which one is first in the modify list, right? So think of it this way. If you, trying to think of something that would be a good example. Well, even a person, right? If you squash down, like if you sort of squat and then bend, right? Then that's sort of like a squatted version that's kind of curling over, right, of you. If you instead bend and then sort of squash down, then it's a slightly different interpretation of that shape, right? So the order in which these two deformers happen will change the shape of the object. And so that means we probably should have some thought about which one we want to apply first. But even if we choose the wrong thing, we can always change that later, okay? So what I'm going to do is start with these two objects. I'm going to select them both, and I'm going to put a bend modifier on both of them, okay, at the same time. So but I have two models selected. It will deform them as if they're one. So deform, nonlinear, bend. And so again, curvature, we can get our bottle to bend now, okay? Now, I'm gonna, so we see how that works. I should have thought this through. I'm gonna start with the squash and stretch just because it's a little harder to understand. And then we're gonna add the bend on top of that. So sorry about that. Deformer, nonlinear, squash, right? And so as we saw before, factor, it's gonna make this bottle squash and stretch, right? But again, if we wanted it to push off from the ground, it's right now stretching from the middle, right? So what I'm going to do, and this part always confuses people. So I'll say it, and then I'll do it, and then I'll do it again, right? I'm going to move the entire squash and stretch deformer all the way down to the ground, right? So you'll see right now on the value, the translate Y, it is 9.41. That means it's 9 units up in the air. If I actually just type 0 right there, it'll go down to the ground, right? So it's now the move handle is at 0, 0, 0. It's at the origin. It's on the ground, right? And if I did squash and stretch now, if I change factor now, you'll see that it's squash and stretching the bottom, but it's not affecting the top part of the bottle. It's also trying to squash and stretch some stuff that's underneath the ground as well. We can see that because it extends out below it, right? So the first thing I want to do is make sure to not waste any of my energy on this stuff that doesn't exist, right? And the way I'll do that is I'll just take my low bound down to 0. Right? And so that means now there's nothing below my origin, right? It's not deforming anything below my bend handle, right? But it's still only deforming about half of my bottle, right? It's still only going halfway up my bottle. So what I'm going to do from there is extend my high bound up to the top. It's probably going to be 2. We maybe want to go like 2.1 or something like that just to make it go a little bit past it and make sure we're getting everything, right? And so now with that, if I adjust my squash and stretch, I'm able to get some squash and stretch on my bottle. Send that to 0. Okay. However, as we've already seen, if I go move my bottle, stuff really breaks, right? So does anybody need me to go over those changes again on the squash and stretch values? I don't know if anybody's following along or if this is... Anybody?
I can't seem to get it to work, but
The squash and stretch? Is it not creating one, or is it? Oh, is that your? Oh, okay.
So for squash,
Yeah, the deformer is just called squash. But the opposite of squash is stretch.
yeah. So like if I do this number, use your imagination for now. Right? Factor. That's squash.
My advice. If I just how that's
And then he's like, "Oh, you're a DMC person." I'm like, "Yeah, dude, I am." He's like, "Oh, yes, like I was listening." Not Joey's like, "Hey, I think he did, but couldn't place it. So like he was like, "I know I mentioned her, but
It kind of puts it as these little factual piece
I know I know this
wherever.
person that's not point."
So try moving your translate line down to value. And set your low bound as 0, your high bound as a 2.
Didn't know what shape to make it.
And then try to adjust this.
That's usually not that. Tell my head is shit. Why is it not? Is there a way to adjust it more precisely?
Precisely, that's what I was just getting ready to say. So, I want to show you something. I know a few people just walking around, I've seen that when you're adjusting your squash and stretch, if you just click out here on the number of factor and slide it, it's going to increment it like in these big chunks, right? Like it's like it goes like a whole number at a time, right? And that's not very useful because like you may want just a little bit of squash and stretch. One of the things you can do is if you hold control while you're doing that, it will make it smaller, like the value will be smaller. The other way you can do this is if you click the word factor and then middle click out here in the viewport and drag side to side with your middle click, that will also be a little bit more precise. And then actually if you did control middle click out here, it's like super, I guess down to like the hundredths, right? So you can get really subtle adjustments, right? Okay. All right. Now the problem with this is if I squash and stretch this and I move the object, right? Let's go ahead and do some squash on this. And then I go move my control to move my object. It's going to do this. How do I fix that? How would you think you would fix that?
Would you parent the squash handle to the bottle, or would you just do it to the control?
So that's a good question. So why would we do either? Let me ask you that.
Well, if you want to move the bottle,
Mm-hmm.
you would have to click on the bottle for it to move, and you would go another step further to move the pin.
Right. Well, so the biggest thing is that we just need that bend modifier. We need this squash one handle. We just need it to go everywhere the bottle goes, right? And so actually either would probably work, but I think the cleanest would just be to put this squash one handle underneath that bottle control, right? And so if we did that, I'm going to go ahead and middle click, squash one handle, drop it on bottle control. It doesn't look like anything changed, but now when I move my control, everything goes with it, right? And then if I want to squash and stretch it, I can still go back here to factor. Now, what do you, when we talk about rigging, what is the purpose of rigging something?
Or for animation.
They kind of give it digital joints.
Yeah, so, but it's so an animator can control it, right? Because we can, I mean, if we think about our model, like, yeah, we could just model our model, and then we could give that to the animator and be like, all right, there's 5,000 or 500,000 vertices in there, and you got to move them one at a time, right? Like, that's not very useful, right? Strangely, that is to some extent how 3D animation started, right? All rigging is a way to make this model or this object more easily animatable, right? More easy for the animator to manipulate it and get a performance out of it, right? Because getting something to actually seem to come to life is hard enough already, right? So one of the issues with this right now is even though we have this set up, right? I could grab my control and move it. I could grab my bend handle and squash it. I want to make that even easier, right? I want to make this so easy that the only thing you have to animate is the control. The only thing you have to set any keyframes on are the controls, right? And then we can just hide the bend handle and just control everything from one like master control, right? So let's do that. How I'm going to do this is I'm going to go ahead and grab that object again, set that back to 0. And so this is the object I want to be able to control, this bottle control ring, right? This NURB circle. And I want that to control everything else, but all it really has in my channel box is my translates, rotates, and scales, right? These are called channels, right, or attributes. And what I'm just going to do is I'm just going to add some more attributes. Like, that's just not enough. Right? I need one in there that will also control the squash and stretch. I need one in there that will control the bend, right? And so we can start adding things to this control, adding like values to this control, and then wiring them to other things to control them, right? So this is actually super easy to add that attribute. You just grab the object you want to add, which is this ring, right? And I go to modify, and then add attribute. Right? It's going to ask me, what do I want it to be named? There's also a couple of other options in here. There's different types of data in Maya, right? Like one of them is a float value, which means it can be any number, positive or negative with a decimal, right? But then there's integer, which is a whole number, right? Or Boolean, which may be like a yes or no answer, right? Or enum or enum is really like if you want to like choose from a bunch of different words, right? Or a bunch of different preset values. So I'm going to use float because my factor in my bend modifier is, or my squash modifier is a float value as well, right? But just recognize that there's a whole bunch of different kinds of values in here. And I'm just going to call this squash. Okay. You'll see that I can put a minimum and a maximum on there if I want to. Right now, I'm not going to worry about that, but know that you can sort of limit yourself on that so you don't accidentally animate it too far. Right now, I'm not going to worry about it, though. Just go ahead and hit OK. And I want you to watch what happens over in my channel box when I hit OK. Ready? There it is. Squash. A completely new attribute, right? But it doesn't do anything, right? Right now, it's just a label, right? Right now, it's just a value with a label on it. And if I adjust that, I can change that number all day long. It affects nothing, right? So to make it affect something, I have to connect it to something. I want to tie this a little bit to programming for you. How many of you hate any scripting or programming that you've ever had to do? Anybody? How many of you really enjoy that part of it? Nobody? How many of you don't like raising your hand? If you've never done it, that's cool. So this is very similar to all we're really doing there, right? Once you get into the Principles of Game Design class, you'll be doing some scripting in Construct. We can call it scripting. It's really just connecting like commands together, right? Maya has its own way of scripting things as well. In fact, there's entire programming languages you can use inside of Maya. If you know how to write in Python, Python exists inside of Maya and you can write your own scripts. If anybody was at the portfolio review last night and saw Josh Roberts, he's writing his own plugins for Maya. Like that's what he's doing. All of these are jobs. I just want to keep reiterating that that's what you're learning to do here is any of these branches, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to connect this squash and stretch, or this squash attribute that I just made right there. I'm going to connect it to the factor attribute on my squash handle. And basically whenever I change my squash value on my control, it's just going to update the factor value, right? So the way we can do that is just a direct connection. So I'll show you how to do that. We go to Windows, General Editor, and then Connection Editor. And so this feels a little complicated because this is going to start propagating with a bunch of words up here in just a second. But it's actually pretty simple to understand. Basically, whatever's on this side, on your output, whatever you select over here, will control whatever you select over here on your inputs, right? Whatever you select on the left will control whatever you select on the right. So right now there's nothing in there. So I have to load some things in there. So what is the thing I want to be driving this? What is the thing that I want to control this?
Factor.
Is factor what I want to control? What I want to control or what I want to, let me rephrase that. Factor is what I want to be affected by this change I make, right? So in that case, that needs to be what's on the right. So what is it that I want to control factor?
Squash.
The squash, right? And that is on my control here, right? Squash 1. So if I select that control and hit reload left, you'll see it loads my bottle control. And all of the different values that are on my bottle control, including like my visibility, my translates, my rotates, a whole bunch of stuff that you probably don't know what it is. And all the way down here at the bottom, squash. Same right there? Yes.
Sorry, where did you get the first connection at?
It's under Windows, General Editors, Connection Editor. Okay? So, if this squash attribute is what we want to be doing the driving, the thing that we want to be driven is that factor on the squash handle, right? So I'm going to select it, the squash 1 handle, and this is a little confusing. Because you see when I select squash 1 handle, what I get over here is my translates and rotates, right? That is the object itself, right? The thing that's making the deformation happen is that squash 1 under our inputs, right? When we see this, see right here, that's what's actually making that happen. So if I just reload what I have selected right now, we're not going to be able to find factor in this list. What I actually have to do is click this squash 1 input right there, and then hit reload right, and you'll see that there's factor. Okay? So the way I do this is I just click squash on this side, factor on that side, and I'm done, right? So if I click squash, then it asks, what do I want to connect to squash? I could click all of them if I wanted to, but the only thing I really wanted to be driven is factor, right? So when I did that, I want you to notice what happened to factor over here. Over here in my squash 1 handle, now it has a little yellow box next to it, right? Whenever something changes colors in your channel box, that means something else is controlling it. So what is controlling factor? Anybody?
Squash.
That squash value that is on our control, right? So now when I hit close, you'll see that if I select this object and change my squash over here, it's going to control all of that, which means I can actually now just hide my squash handle, Control H to hide it, because I don't need to see it anymore. Everything that I need to animate my object moving and squashing is now just on that ring, right? That's all I have to set keyframes on, and I can animate all of those things together. This is just like the bouncing ball rig, where we had the squash on that. We had the RX, RY, RZ on that. Okay? So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add some bend to this, right? So that means I'll have both squash and bend on this. But I'm going to add a couple of other things to the bend as well, right? We noticed that we can make this connection editor connect anything, right? So I'm going to make an option to bend it, but that's really just going to bend it from side to side. And I don't want to make a bend modifier for every direction I want this object to be able to bend. So I'm just going to make one of them, and then I'm going to animate or also make a control that allows me to rotate that bend modifier. That way I can bend it in a different direction, okay? And I could go even further and make one that also allows me to slide it up and down so I can control at which point the object is bending, right? So let's go ahead and do that. So if I go ahead and grab these objects, deform, nonlinear, bend. Right? So my bend one handle, if I go to bend one, my curvature, look at that, it's working, right? Now what I want to be able to happen though is I want to be able to rotate this and change the angle in which it's bending, right? I also want to be able to move this up and down and change the location in which it's bending, right? And so those things are pretty easy to see. That's just my rotate Y. See how that value is changing there? And my translate Y. And so just by adding those three attributes, I can add a bend, sort of a bend height, and a bend angle, right? And I can connect all those things together, those attributes, and control all of that from one control. So first I want to make sure this curvature is kind of working the way I want it to, right? I'll go ahead and add this curvature to it, right? But again, I don't really care about that low bound part. I'll take that out. Go ahead and move this down to 0. Go ahead and move my high bound up to a little bit over 2, right? And so now I should be able to get some curvature like that. And if I rotate this, I can get it here. And again, I can move this up and down to get a difference and all of that, right? Okay. And yet again, this bend one modifier needs to be under this control, because if I move this, that's really going to mess some stuff up, right? All right. So bend one modifier, drag that on bottle control. And then I'm going to grab this bottle control and I'm going to add those three new attributes. So modify, add attribute. I'm going to call this bend, hit add, bend height, add, and then bend angle, hit add, okay? So all three of those are on there now, but yet again, they're not doing anything, right? So to connect these, it's the connection editor. I go to Windows, General Editors, and Connection Editor. And the bottle control is what is driving everything. So I'm going to select bottle control, reload left. You'll see that those three new attributes are down there on the bottom. And the thing that we need to control is either on the bend one handle, right, my translate Y or my rotate Y, or this bend one curvature, right? So I'm just going to go ahead and grab bend 1 and hit reload right. And I'm going to go ahead and connect my bend to my, where's that? I'm not seeing it. Curvature. There we go. All right, so you see now curvature is on there. And then again, if I select just the bend handle by itself and reload right, now I'll get my translates and my rotates. So my bend height, so under this translate, it's grayed out, but if I open that up, you'll see that my bend height is translate Y, and my bend angle is rotate Y. So now with all of that, I should be able to bend my object, change the angle of that bend, change the height of that bend. So I can get quite a bit of different deformation in here. And on top of that, I can also squash my object. So I want you to notice the difference between this squash and stretch, right, and what you may have expected to happen with squash and stretch, which is maybe you expected this whole thing to kind of squash down while it's in that same amount of bend, right? That is just dependent, like what it is you want to happen there is dependent on the input order of those two deformers, right? And so you'll see that when I select my model here, right, the input order is currently bend 1 and then squash 1, right? I can change the order in which those happen. Okay? The way we do that is I select this object, right, and right-click on it and go to Inputs, select all inputs. I'm sorry. Inputs, not select all inputs, but all inputs at the bottom here, right? And that's going to bring up all of our inputs, right? And you'll see there's a bend 1 and a squash 1. And if I just middle click and change those orders, we're going to get a different result. So I'll do the same here. And so now that curvature still looks, or that bend still looks the same, right? But my squash, when I squash my object, is going to squash differently, right? It's not going to squash around that curve. It's going to squash up and down. So really the question is, what is it you want it to do? That's kind of up to you as the animator and as the person who's planning on animating this. I'll be honest, I actually like the way it was before a little better. That's just my 2 cents. So I'm going to go ahead and undo those things that I just did. I just wanted to show you that those are options. I want my, there we go, did that work? Yeah, there we go. And again, I'll just grab my bend 1 handle, Control H. Now everything that I need to animate this object is on this one control. And if I hit S, I can pose this entire object together, right? So that's my starting pose, but I could have this object squash down a little bit and maybe bend. Let's get a little bit more bend on this. Bend back. Right. And you'll see that that's going to all deform together now, right? And I probably want my bend angle to be -90 on this one too, just to. So now my object bends back, right? And then I can animate it leaning forward. Bending forward. Stretching out, right? All of this is stuff that I can start animating now to get my animation. Now we're going to talk about the animation part of this later in the next class, or you can sort of move ahead and look at some of the videos that I posted earlier in that playlist. The playlist that I posted was like last week sometime, covers this entire project. I don't think it has the bouncing ball, but it has all of this modeling, and it's basically the faster version of what we're going over in class. So, how many of you are lost? All right, all right, yeah. All right, that's fine. I don't know, like this one's interesting. Sometimes I like, yeah, oh, it's really cool stuff. But hopefully this is something you can go back and watch the video. So, I know we're kind of. I want to give you a little bit of time to be working in class, but again, next class period is just open lab time for you to be working. I'll be in here to help answer any questions. I'll be here over the break. But before I'm going to go ahead and end the video, but I want to have a conversation with you about the videos, actually. So I'm going to go ahead and stop this and just get your input on this.